Hi, this is the Outlet channel. I'm Domingos Criado, and you are on the OAuth track, where we on Outlet post videos explaining all the relevant specification for you. This video is going to be an introduction to OAuth, what is in the scope and what is out of the scope of OAuth. So let's get started. OAuth was published in 2012 by ETF, replaced OAuth 1 without backward compatibility, and has created a simpler solution for the major use case, and created also all the extensions required to address more complex scenarios. So what is OAuth 2? So it creates a framework that allows web API clients to access HTTP protected resources on domains with limited access or on behalf of the owner of the resource. There are 4 roles defined on OAuth. The first one is the resource owner. Usually it's a person, someone that owns the data that he wants to use it. And he's going to use it via an API client. For instance, let's use the scenario of a webmail. Me, Domingos Criado, I'm the owner of a mailbox in a provider. I might not be using the client that is provided by that domain. I might be using something different. The software I'm using will act as a client. The client here is going to be a software that are outside of the domain that access my resources. My resource is going to be hosted by a resource server that's protecting it. In the webmail sample, the resource server might be the one that protecting my mailbox or my list of contacts on it. And before the client can access my mailbox, he needs to interact with the authorization server that will run all the authorization process for granting an access token to that client in order to access the resource server. So let's go back to how the interaction of it works. So the client creates an authorization request and to be sent to the authorization server. The authorization server has 2 roles. One is collecting the approval and logging the resource owner, as well as providing an access token. So to do that, the authorization server has 2 different roles that will be implemented by 2 different endpoints. So there's one endpoint called authorization endpoint that's used for collecting and approving the access to the client by the resource owner. There's another endpoint that can be used, which is the token. That will produce the access token that will be used by the client to access the resource server. So what is the content of an authorization request that the client might send it? There are multiple paths that can take it, but the general structure is like this. The client needs to identify itself. He needs to send his identifier and his credential. His credential might be a secret, a long password that will be stored, or it can be something different, like for instance, an MTLS certificate that will be used for mutual authentication. Or it can be, for instance, a token, a JWT token signed by a private key that the only client has, a private key. There are also two different parameters that are dependent upon what is the actual endpoint the client is interacting with. One is the response type, another is the grant type. I will show you in further detail what is exactly and where each of those parameters are used. The scopes are not defined, hardly defined on the specification. It's per domain base. So depending upon the domain that we are running, the scope might be different. It might be even different on the same domain across different deployments, while other might decompose it. One can read it, another one can post new message, another can access the contact list. And the state that can be used by the client to protect itself against cross-request forgery attacks. It also allows the client to externalize its state in order to, while running the authorization process, it can reason about the response he got. After processing the authorization request, collecting the user approval, and also, for instance, make sure that the user is logged in, and if there's any multi-effect on it, the user is completed, the authorization server will create a response. The response has an access token that will materialize the actual authorization of the client on the domain to access the resources. Optionally, a refresh token that can be used by the client to extend its session. We'll show it later on this series. What exactly does the refresh token can be used for? The granted scopes, for instance, the client might ask multiple permissions, but the end user might not be granted all of it. And the expiry date, which says how many seconds does the access token is valid for. So with the transfer from AS to the client now has the token possession, which means that he has all the data, the piece of data that he needs to access the resource server. He sent it to the resource server, and how this transfer is done, it's described on a different specification that was published in conjunction with the OAuth 2.0, which was the bear token. I will show in the further videos how exactly this transport is defined on that spec. But the resource server will get this token, process it, verify that access is valid enough, and grant the client the protected resource that he's asking for. So how exactly is the interaction between the client and the authorization server? It's vary upon multiple factors, multiple use cases. The OAuth specification defines 4 different flows, I would say, that specify different ways of the client can interact with the 2 endpoints that are provided by the authorization server. 3 of them ensures that the client access is on behalf of a customer. First one, authorization code. That's used for on the very general scenario, covering the most of it. And probably that's the only one that will reach OAuth 2.1. The implicit flow, that was created for addressing the scenario of single page apps. The resource owner, that's very specific scenario that was introduced by OAuth 2.0, addressing the requirement for the client impersonating and presenting the customer credential to the authorization server. The resource owner is for sure the most controversial one. The OAuth was designed mainly to prevent the client to process the customer credentials, and that breaks a lot of it. The client's credential is used by clients accessing the domain in order to manage its data. Or another scenario that I see often is that customer is using the client credential to authenticate components that are running that doesn't require a resource owner, and they are managed by the enterprise, but they are outside of the domain. For instance, like kiosks, ATMs. Another scenario for the client credential is on the open banking, where one bank needs to connect to another, set up all the payment details before the customer authenticated and approve that process. Each flow has a different security property and use different endpoints of the authorization server. So I will detail later each of those flows in further videos, showing exactly what is the security properties of it and how each of those flows interacts with which endpoint on the authorization server. And the other flows can be defined as well. Okay, for a general introduction, we're seeing the initial structure, and it will be really better for you to understand what is not on the scope of OAuth, in order for you to make sure that you know why you're looking for such a thing. This is the timeline of specification that has been published in the recent year towards the financial industry. And you might see that by the count, a lot of things out of the scope of the OAuth. So let's go back to general scope. So when the client sends an authorization request to the authorization server, one thing that we haven't addressed is, one thing that's not clear is how the client finds the authorization server. That's not defined by the OAuth specification. It's been defined later by OAuth metadata. Another aspect of it is how the client gets provisional on the authorization server. That has been addressed by 2 different specifications, the dynamic client registration and the protocol for managing it. There are 2 different RFCs that we'll show you later. How can the client express exactly the resource he wants to access? There are 2. One is the resource indicators, another one is reach authorization request, or HAR. Further videos. Another one is the request object. How can the AS make sure that the request will not tamper? The client might have created a request, and what is hitting the authorization server might be different, right? So how can the authorization server make sure that the content of the request not tampered. There are two different requests for that. One is inside the OpenID Connect that we'll show you later. The other one is the JWT authorization request, JAR for short. Another aspect of it is what is the format of the token that we are publishing. So the client will receive a token, an access token, but what is the format of it? Even after those years, there is not clear definition of what is the standard format for the access token to be presented in a JWT format. There is a specification in queue to be published that will address this. The other one is when the resource server receives a request from an API client with an access token, the resource server needs to evaluate it. It needs to reason about the access token, if it's valid or not, it belongs to that client or not, and what are the permissions on it. The endpoint for the resource server to inquiry the authorization server is introduced later by access token introspection specification in 2016. And finally, who the user is. How the client can pull the attributes or know who the user is. That's not addressed here as well on the OAuth, and it's addressed on a different specification that will show, we'll cover later in much more details, which is the OpenID Connect. Even with the important requirements out of the scope of OAuth 2, it's been a sounding success. It allowed simple solutions for simple use case and provide extension points that were used by the community to address different scenarios. Those extensions allow the OAuth to be implemented across different industries, on the financial, on the healthcare, on IoT, for instance, with very limited access. So that's it. This is for our initial introduction. So if you like this material, don't forget subscribe to the channel and give the thumbs up if you like it. And there are more videos to come covering all the details that I've shown you. Thank you.